Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. The grand academic institution on Oceani 9 wasn't just impressive. It was the kind of place that made you feel small, insignificant, and possibly underqualified just by walking through the doors, which, honestly, was probably the point. Nothing said prestigious center of learning, quite like architecture designed to give students an inferiority complex before they even sat down. The main auditorium could hold 3,000 beings, and today it was packed. Not because the subject was particularly exciting, galactic history rarely got hearts racing, but because Instructor Malrax was teaching, and Malrax had a reputation. 6 arms, luminescent purple skin that shifted colors with his moods, and an ego that could be seen from orbit. The kind of academic who pronounced words like methodology with unnecessary emphasis, just to remind everyone how smart he was. Today's lecture, Ancient Galactic Conflicts 501, with a special focus on the Prime War. The holographic display dominated the front of the auditorium, showing star systems gone dark, worlds reduced to lifeless rocks, civilizations wiped from existence. Dramatic music swelled in the background, because, of course, Malrax had a soundtrack for his lectures. The being loved theater almost as much as he loved hearing himself talk. And thus, Malrax intoned, 4 of his 6 arms spread wide in a gesture of academic grandeur, the Prime War concluded with the absolute, total, and complete extinction of every advanced species in the galaxy. Not a single civilization survived. Not one being remained to tell the tale. The galaxy fell silent for 3 million cycles, a tomb of ambition and hubris. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the auditorium like a heavy blanket. Students from a dozen different species scribbled notes furiously. A pair of insectoid scholars clicked their mandibles in what passed for thoughtful agreement. 3 crystalline beings chimed softly, their resonance frequencies indicating deep contemplation. Even the floating consciousness entities, notoriously difficult to impress, dimmed their containment fields in respectful acknowledgement of the tragedy. In the back row, slouched so far down in her seat she was practically horizontal, Belle was eating chips. Not quietly, either. The crunch echoed in the reverent silence like someone tap-dancing in a library. Belle was human, the only human in a class of 283 students, which already made her stand out. But it wasn't just her species that drew attention. It was the way she treated galactic academia like a particularly amusing television show, complete with snacks and commentary. She'd arrived on Oceani 9 3 weeks ago as part of Earth's Expeditionary Education Program, a fancy title that basically meant, let's see if humans can handle real school. So far, the jury was out. Malrax's skin flickered orange, annoyance, but he continued. The evidence is irrefutable. The 2 archaeological surveys, the astrobiological records, the quantum-dated artifacts, all point to the same inescapable conclusion. The Prime War ended all species, every single one. He said those last 3 words like he was hammering nails into a coffin, each syllable a period at the end of a sentence that would accept no revision. Belle raised her hand. Malrax didn't see it at first. He was too busy advancing to his next holographic slide, which showed a timeline stretching back 3 million cycles, with a big dramatic red line marking the end. Very subtle. Very academic. Belle's hand stayed up, and now she was waving it slightly, Chip's bag rustling. A tentacled student named Silas, sitting 2 rows ahead, noticed first. One of their appendages tapped their neighbor, And soon a ripple of awareness spread through the auditorium. Students turning, looking, pointing with whatever appendages they possessed. Malrax finally noticed the disturbance and followed the gaze of his students to the back row, where the human sat with one hand raised and the other still in her chips bag. His skin went scarlet. "Yes? Miss Bell, is it? Do you have a question, or are you simply requesting permission to continue disrupting my lecture with your snacking?" Bell pulled her hand out of the bag, looked at the chip she was holding, then ate it anyway. "Actually, yeah, I do have a question." "By all means." Malrax's voice dripped with the kind of condescension that came from decades of academic superiority. "Please, enlighten us with your inquiry." "So," Bell said, sitting up slightly, but not enough to be considered proper posture. "If the Prime War ended all species, and nobody survived, and everyone died—" She paused, tilted her head. "Then who's telling you this?" The auditorium went so quiet, you could hear the soft hum of the environmental systems. Malrax blinked, all 6 of his eyes, one after another, like dominoes falling. Excuse me? Who's telling you this happened?" Bell repeated, slower this time, like she was explaining basic arithmetic to a child. "You just said everyone died. Total extinction. Not a single being survived. But somehow we know about it. We have records. Somebody named it the Prime War. Somebody built monuments. Somebody wrote down what happened." She gestured around the auditorium. "I mean, I'm no expert on extinction events, but usually when everyone dies, there's nobody left to file the paperwork." Somewhere in the middle rows, Gif, a massive student whose species resembled ambulatory boulders, made a sound like grinding rocks. It took Bell a second to realize he was laughing. Malrax's skin was now cycling through colors so fast he looked like a malfunctioning traffic signal. "That is, you are oversimplifying a complex historical. The archaeological evidence clearly indicates." "Evidence recorded by whom?" Bell asked, and there wasn't any malice in her voice. She sounded genuinely curious, like a kid, asking why the sky was blue, which somehow made it worse. "By the archivists, obviously," Malrax snapped. "The primary sources come from the Great Archives on Secundus 12, maintained by species that survived," Bell finished. Another pause, this one longer. "The archivists are an ancient civilization who survived the thing that killed everyone." Malrax opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked like a fish, if fish had 6 arms and were having an existential crisis. Endless, a floating consciousness contained in a shimmering sphere, drifted slightly to the left, the equivalent of leaning forward with interest. Her sphere pulsed with soft golden light, her species' way of indicating engagement with a topic. "The human raises an interesting point," Anlis said, her voice emanating from a translator attached to her containment field. "The logical paradox is quite apparent when stated plainly." "There is no paradox." Malrax's voice went up an octave. "The Prime War resulted in the extinction of the dominant civilizations, the major powers, the species that were waging the conflict. Obviously, some minor species, some primitive cultures survived to document—" "So not everyone died," Bell said. "The major civilizations." "But you said everyone. You said not a single being remained. You've got it on a slide and everything." Bell pointed at the holographic display, which was still showing the end in big dramatic letters. "That seems pretty definitive." Silas had pulled out a data slate and was now scrolling through something rapidly, their tentacles moving with increasing agitation. "Instructor Malrax, if I may, I'm looking at the primary source citations for this lecture, and Bell is correct. The earliest post-war records are dated only 200 cycles after the supposed extinction event. The archives themselves contain continuous records with no gaps. There are trade agreements, cultural exchanges, even poetry from the period immediately following the war. Poetry, Giff rumbled, still chuckling. Dead people writing poetry. That's a neat trick. Malrax was now a color Bell didn't have a name for, somewhere between purple and the concept of regret. You are all misunderstanding the established academic interpretation, the consensus among historians. Consensus based on what? Bell asked. She still wasn't being rude, just persistent, like a lawyer cross-examining a witness. Look, on Earth, we've got tons of stories about extinction-level events. The Bronze Age collapse, the fall of Rome, the Black Death, all of them described as the end of civilization by people at the time. But you know what all those events had in common? She paused for effect, then grinned. Somebody stuck around to complain about it afterward. The grinding sound of Giff's laughter got louder. More students were joining in now, not mocking laughter, but the kind that came from recognizing an absurdity you'd somehow missed. An insectoid student clicked their mandibles in a pattern that Bell's translator rendered as amused agreement. The crystalline beings were chiming in a frequency that suggested they were conferring among themselves, probably re-evaluating everything they'd learned. Bell wasn't done. She stood up, Chip's bag in hand, and started walking down the aisle toward the front of the auditorium. Nobody had given her permission. She hadn't raised her hand. She just did it. Malrax watched her approach with the expression of someone watching a natural disaster and being powerless to stop it. Here's another question, Bell said, arriving at the front and turning to face the class, like she was the instructor now. If this war killed everyone, wiped out all advanced life, ended every civilization, how come the galaxy didn't just stay empty? I mean, evolution takes time, right? Millions of cycles to go from primitive to spacefaring. But according to your timeline, new civilizations popped up within, what, 500,000 cycles? She looked at Malrax. That's really fast. Suspiciously fast. Almost like maybe the galaxy wasn't as empty as the history books claim. Silas's tentacles were moving faster now, scrolling through data. She's right. The timeline for the emergence of post-war civilizations is inconsistent with standard evolutionary models, unless, they paused, unless the civilizations weren't emerging, unless they were already there. And Liss pulsed brightly. You're suggesting the Prime War wasn't an extinction event at all. I'm suggesting, Bell said, tossing a chip in the air and catching it in her mouth, that maybe the galaxy's historians need better fact-checkers, because this whole story has more holes than my grandmother's claim that she walked to school uphill both ways. Malrax had gone through the entire color spectrum and arrived at a pale, washed-out gray. You cannot simply. 3 million cycles of accepted scholarship cannot be dismissed by basic logic? Bell offered helpfully. The instructor's 6 arms hung limply at his sides. Students were now actively debating among themselves, pulling up archives on their personal devices, questioning everything. The carefully controlled atmosphere of academic reverence had been replaced by chaotic curiosity, the kind that came from having a fundamental assumption challenged. Bell walked over to the holographic controls and, with Malrax too stunned to stop her, pulled up a new display. Okay, let's try this. Show me every documented survivor group from the Prime War. The display flickered, then populated with names, and more names. Dozens of species claiming to be the sole survivors. Multiple accounts, of the last remnants of civilization. Conflicting narratives about who survived where and how. Huh, Bell said, studying the list. That's a lot of soul survivors. Almost like the galaxy had a really generous definition of extinction. Gif was openly laughing now, a sound like an avalanche of pebbles. This is the best lecture I've ever attended. Malrax finally found his voice, though it sounded defeated. The historical record is complex. Interpretations vary. What I teach is the standard academic understanding. Which might be wrong, Bell said, not unkindly. She looked at him, and her expression softened slightly. Look, I'm not trying to destroy your career or anything, but come on. If we're going to learn history, shouldn't it at least make sense? She turned back to the class. Who wants to actually figure out what happened? Because I'm betting the real story is way more interesting than everyone died, except somehow they didn't. Every hand, tentacle, appendage, and consciousness field in the auditorium went up. Malrax looked at his ruined lecture, his shattered certainty, his students now more interested in the human's questions than his answers. His skin settled on a resigned blue. Class dismissed, he said quietly. Then, after a long pause, he looked at Bell. Meet me in my office. We need to talk. Bell grabbed her chips bag. Sure thing. But just so we're clear, I'm bringing snacks. Malrax's office was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd spent the better part of 6 decades in academia. Cluttered with artifacts, lined with data crystals containing published papers, and decorated with certificates that screamed, "I'm very important. Please take me seriously." There was even a small holographic display cycling through images of Malrax receiving various awards, shaking hands, or equivalent appendages, with other distinguished scholars. Bell took one look at it and had to physically restrain herself from laughing. Sit, Malrax said, gesturing to a chair designed for beings with fewer limbs than him. His skin had settled into a dark indigo, which Bell's translator helpfully informed her meant thoughtful contemplation mixed with irritation. Bell sat, opened her chips bag, and waited. Malrax stared at her for a long moment, 6 arms folded across his torso, in what was probably meant to be an intimidating pose. Do you have any idea what you've done? Pointed out a logical inconsistency? Bell offered, crunching through another chip. You've undermined 3 million cycles of established historical consensus in front of 283 students, Malrax said, his voice tight. Students who will now question everything they've learned. Students who will spread this skepticism throughout the academic community. You say that like it's a bad thing. It is. Malrax's skin flashed bright yellow. Alarm. Academia functions on the foundation of accepted knowledge. If students question everything, how can we teach them anything? Bell leaned back in her chair, still holding her chips. Okay, real talk. That's exactly backward. Good students should question everything. That's literally how you learn. By testing what? You think you know against reality and seeing if it holds up? But the Prime War is apparently not what you think it is, Bell interrupted. Look, I'm not trying to be a jerk here. Well, okay, maybe a little. But come on, you had to have noticed the holes in that story at some point, right? Malrax's skin rippled through several shades of purple. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally slumped in his chair. The accepted interpretation. Every textbook, every scholarly paper, every scholar repeating what the last scholar said, who repeated what the scholar before them said, going back who knows how long, Bell finished. It's like academic telephone. The message gets distorted. But nobody checks because everyone assumes somebody else already did. There was a knock at the door, which was impressive since the door was more of an energy field than a physical barrier. Silas slid through, tentacles waving apologetically. "Forgive the intrusion, Instructor, but I needed to show you something." Behind Silas came Gif, who had to duck to fit through the doorway, and Anneliese, her containment sphere floating at head height. The small office suddenly felt very crowded. "We've been doing some additional research," Silas said, their tentacles moving in agitated patterns. Bell's questions prompted us to actually examine the primary sources rather than just the secondary analyses, and, well, the discrepancies are substantial. They held up a data slate, which projected a holographic timeline. "Look at this. The extinction event supposedly occurred at cycle marker 2088-342, but we have trade records from only 18 cycles later between the archivists and the Nomrathi. Not emergency survival agreements, regular commodity exchanges, luxury goods, cultural artifacts, academic texts. People buying art right after the apocalypse?" Bell said, grinning. "That's optimistic." Gif rumbled with laughter, his rocky surface vibrating. "It gets funnier. I found military records. Apparently, 3 different species filed formal complaints about border violations 60 cycles after everyone supposedly died. Very polite complaints, too. Lots of, 'with all due respect,' and 'we wish to maintain diplomatic relations.'" Anneliese's sphere pulsed. I accessed the linguistic archives. The term we translate as prime war is actually a compound phrase in the original archival language. A more accurate translation would be the conflict that proved to be instructive, or possibly the war that taught us better. Bell sat up straighter. "Wait, so it wasn't even supposed to mean the first war? Or the ultimate war?" "No," Anneliese said, her light dimming slightly, her species equivalent of a grimace. Somewhere in the translation chain, the nuance was lost. Scholars assumed prime meant primary or ultimate. They built entire theories around a mistranslation. Malrax looked like his world was ending, which, ironically, was exactly what he'd been teaching about for decades. His skin had gone pale, almost translucent. But the dead worlds, the abandoned systems, the archaeological evidence of massive destruction. "Oh, that stuff's real," Bell said. "The war definitely happened. Things definitely got wrecked. But there's a big difference between catastrophic war that devastated civilizations and extinction event that killed literally everyone." She stood up and walked over to Malrax's window, which overlooked the campus quad. Students were gathered in clusters, clearly still debating what had happened in class. "You know what I think? I think the people who lived through it described it as the end of their world. Because it was. Their way of life ended. Their civilizations collapsed. Their certainties got shattered. But they meant it metaphorically. And somewhere along the way, historians started taking it literally." Silas's tentacles stopped moving, going completely still, a sign of sudden realization. The great humbling. Everyone looked at them. "That's another translation option for the original phrase," Silas explained, scrolling rapidly through their data slate. "The war that made us humble. The conflict that taught us our place." They looked up, their eye stalks focused on Malrax. What if the Prime War wasn't about extinction? What if it was about learning limits? Gif shifted his massive weight, causing the floor to creak. So, what? A bunch of civilizations got too big for their britches, fought each other to a standstill, and then everyone collectively decided to calm down. It would explain the rapid emergence of new civilizations, Anneliese mused. They weren't new. They were old civilizations that had been overshadowed by the major powers, finally getting a chance to develop without interference. Belle snapped her fingers. Yes, like how after World War II, you got decolonization and a bunch of nations that had been under imperial control suddenly becoming independent. The war didn't end humanity. It ended a particular way of organizing human societies. Malrax was very quiet. His skin had gone through so many color changes in the past hour that it seemed to have given up and settled on a neutral gray. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been teaching this wrong for 26 cycles. 26 cycles? Belle said. How long has this interpretation been standard? About 800 cycles, Malrax admitted. Since the reformation of academic standards. Belle whistled. That's a long time to be wrong. I published papers, Malrax continued, and now his voice had a hollow quality to it. I wrote a textbook. It's used in 600 institutions across 40 systems. I built my entire reputation on this interpretation. I was awarded the Distinguished Chair of Ancient History, based on my work on the Prime War extinction theory. The office fell silent except for the soft hum of Annelise's containment field. Belle crunched through another chip, then offered the bag to Malrax. Want one? He looked at her like she'd just offered him poison. Look, Belle said, pulling the bag back, I get that this sucks. Nobody likes finding out they've been wrong about something important. But you've got two choices here. You can dig in, defend the old interpretation, and spend the rest of your career fighting a losing battle against evidence. Or, Malrax asked weakly, or you can be the guy who had the guts to admit he was wrong and helped figure out what actually happened, Belle said. Because honestly, the real story sounds way more interesting than the version you've been teaching. Silas waved a tentacle enthusiastically. She's right. Think about it. A galactic conflict so devastating that multiple advanced civilizations collectively decided to step back from the brink. That takes wisdom, cooperation, restraint. That's a much better story than everyone died. The end. Plus, Giff added, it makes more sense. I never understood how everyone could die, but somehow we ended up with detailed records, maintained archives, and preserved cultural artifacts. Dead people are terrible at paperwork. Endless pulsed in agreement. The academic community has been looking for an explanation for the paradoxes in the historical record for generations. This could be the breakthrough that finally makes the pieces fit. Malrax slowly raised his eyes to look at Belle. Why? Why do you care? You're human. You've been in the galaxy for, what, a few cycles at most? This isn't your history. Why challenge it? Belle shrugged. Because it didn't make sense, and I'm allergic to things that don't make sense. Also, because on Earth we've got this saying, question authority. Not because authority is always wrong, but because authority that can't handle being questioned probably doesn't deserve the position in the first place. She grinned. Besides, I'm paying a lot of credits to attend this institution. I'd like my education to actually be, accurate. Malrax made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. The department chair is going to have my hide. The other instructors, the publications board, the academic council, will have to deal with the fact that their theories don't match the evidence, Belle said firmly. And if they're actual scholars, instead of just people protecting their reputations, they'll be excited about the chance to figure out what really happened. Giff leaned against the wall, causing the whole room to shake slightly. So what's the plan? We can't just walk into the academic council and say, hey, everything you've been teaching is wrong. Bye now. No, Silas said slowly, their tentacles beginning to move in thoughtful patterns. But we could request access to the deep archives, the original materials, not the translations and interpretations. If we can demonstrate that the established narrative doesn't match the primary sources, then we'd have grounds for a formal academic inquiry, Anlis finished. The council would have to at least investigate. Bell looked at Malrax. You're the instructor. You've got access to places we don't. You could request a research expedition to the deep archives, right? Take some students as research assistants? Malrax was quiet for a long moment, his 6 arms moving in complex patterns, a sign of deep internal debate among his species. Finally, his skin began to shift toward a determined orange-red. I could, he said slowly. I could frame it as an advanced research project, investigating primary sources for my next publication. He looked at Bell, and there was something in his eyes that might have been respect. But if we do this, if we actually pursue this, there's no going back. My reputation, my career, my legacy, all of it could be destroyed if we're wrong. Good thing we're not wrong, then, Bell said cheerfully. You're very confident for someone who caused this mess. I didn't cause the mess, Bell corrected. I just pointed out it was there. The mess has been there for 800 cycles. Someone just had to be willing to say, hey, this doesn't add up. Gif pushed off from the wall. I'm in. This is the most interesting thing that's happened since I enrolled. As am I, Anlis said. The pursuit of accurate knowledge is the foundation of all learning. Silas's tentacles waved in agreement. If we're going to overturn centuries of scholarship, I want to be part of it. Also, my thesis advisor is going to lose his mind, and I'm petty enough to enjoy that. All eyes turned to Malrax. The instructor looked at his office, at his awards, at the holographic display of his distinguished career. Then he looked at the 4 students in front of him. 3 aliens and 1 human who'd walked into his lecture hall and casually dismantled his life's work with nothing more than basic logic and a bag of chips. His skin flashed through a rapid series of colors, finally settling on a bright, determined gold. Fine, he said. We investigate. Properly. Thoroughly. With actual academic rigor instead of assumptions. He pointed at Bell. But you're writing the formal research proposal. If I'm destroying my career, you're doing the paperwork. Bell grinned. Deal. Do I get academic credit for this? If we're wrong, you get expelled, Malrax said flatly. And if we're right? Malrax's skin flickered with what might have been amusement. If we're right, you get to explain to the academic council how a first-cycle human student overturned 3 million years of established galactic history. I can live with that, Bell said. She held out the chips bag one more time. This time, Malrax took 1. The deep archives beneath the grand academic institution weren't just old. They were ancient in a way that made the concept of time feel negotiable. Stone walls carved by species that didn't exist anymore, climate controls that predated modern technology by millennia, and silence. The kind of profound, heavy silence that made you want to whisper, even though there was nobody around to disturb. This place is creepy, Bell said, her voice echoing off walls that had been standing since before humans figured out agriculture. This place is sacred, Malrax corrected, though his skin had taken on a nervous green tint. These archives contain the original records of galactic civilization, unfiltered, untranslated, uninterpreted. Unorganized too, apparently, Gif rumbled, looking at the maze of corridors stretching in every direction. How are we supposed to find anything in here? Silas was already at a terminal, an ancient interface that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought buttons were too modern. Their tentacles moved over the controls with surprising confidence. The archivists maintained a cataloging system. Everything is indexed by cycle, event type, and civilization of origin. I just need to find the section covering the relevant period. Anlis floated closer to examine a wall covered in what looked like crystallized light. These are memory matrices, physical data storage from before digital compression was invented. Each one contains thousands of documents. So we're looking for a needle in a haystack, Bell said. If the haystack was the size of a city, and the needle was made of the same material as the hay. Essentially, yes, Malrax said. He'd brought his personal data slate and was reviewing the formal research proposal they'd submitted to the Academic Council. We have 8 hours before our access authorization expires. The Council granted this as a courtesy, but they're skeptical. We need to find something substantial. No pressure, Bell muttered. Silas made a triumphant clicking sound. Found it. The Prime War-era records are in subsection 996, Corridor 18, Matrix Storage Level 5. Of course they are, Bell said. Because they couldn't possibly be in, I don't know, Corridor 1? They walked deeper into the archives, passing row after row of ancient storage systems. Some were still active, glowing faintly with preserved data. Others were dark, their contents lost to time or technological obsolescence. Bell couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking through a graveyard of information, where entire civilizations lay buried in forgotten files. Subsection 996 was larger than Bell expected, a chamber the size of a concert hall, walls lined floor to ceiling with memory matrices. Each one pulsed with faint light, containing who knows how many records. Okay, Bell said, staring at the overwhelming quantity of data. Anyone want to revise our 8-hour estimate? Start with the archivist records, Malrax said, his academic instincts taking over. They were the primary record keepers during the period in question. Silas, can you pull up anything labeled as contemporary accounts? Silas interfaced their tentacles directly with the nearest terminal, their body going rigid as data flowed through their nervous system. It was unsettling to watch, like seeing someone have a seizure made of information. After a minute, they disconnected with a gasp. There's so much. Thousands of documents, trade agreements, diplomatic correspondences, military reports, personal journals. From after the supposed extinction? Bell asked. Starting from 2 cycles after, Silas confirmed. And they're not emergency records or survival logs. They're normal bureaucratic documentation, complaints about trade tariffs, arguments over territorial boundaries. Someone even filed a formal protest about noise violations from a neighboring system's industrial operations. Giff laughed, the sound bouncing off the ancient walls. The galaxy supposedly ended, and someone's complaining about loud neighbors? And Liss drifted to another matrix cluster. I'm accessing cultural records, music, art, literature from the immediate post-war period. There's a... Wait. Her containment field flickered. There's a poem here, written 6 cycles after the Prime War supposedly ended all life. What's it say? Bell asked. And Liss's voice took on a rhythmic quality as her translator processed the ancient text. We who survived the fires of ambition, we who saw empires crumble like sand, we who learned that power without wisdom is merely noise, we rebuild, not as we were, but as we must become. The age of conquest ends, the age of growth begins. Silence filled the archive chamber. That's not a survivor's lament, Malrax said quietly. That's a manifesto. That's a conscious choice to change. Bell was pacing now, her mind racing. Okay, so people didn't die. That's established. But that poem, it sounds like they wanted to change, like the war taught them something. Pull up military records, Malrax ordered, his 6 arms moving rapidly as his academic excitement overcame his earlier hesitation. Battle reports, casualty figures, anything that describes the actual conflict. Silas dove back into the data stream, their tentacles trembling with effort. I've got something. A military summary from the Nomrathi High Command. It's... Oh. Oh no. What? Bell, Malrax, and Gif asked simultaneously. The casualty figures aren't about deaths, Silas said slowly. They're about losses in infrastructure, territory, and resources. There are personnel casualties, yes, but they're listed separately and they're surprisingly low. Millions, not billions. Devastating for the individuals involved, but nowhere near extinction level. And Liss was accessing another matrix. I'm finding similar patterns in civilian records. Large-scale evacuations, refugee resettlement programs, emergency housing construction. These are the records of populations that survived and needed to be relocated, not extinct civilizations. Bell stopped pacing and turned to face Malrax. They didn't die out. They exhausted themselves. All these major civilizations fought each other until they couldn't fight anymore. Then they... What? Just stopped? Malrax was scrolling through documents on his data slate, his skin cycling through colors so fast it looked like a rainbow having a panic attack. Here. An archivist treaty dated 12 cycles after the war. It's signed by representatives from 18 different civilizations, including several that supposedly went extinct. He looked up, and his expression was one of stunned realization. It's a demilitarization agreement. They're pledging to reduce their military capabilities, restrict territorial expansion, and submit to oversight by a neutral council. They made peace, Gif said, his gravelly voice filled with wonder. After fighting themselves to exhaustion, they actually made peace. More than that, Bell said, her eyes lighting up. They built a system to prevent it from happening again. That's what the archivists really were. Not just record keepers, but peacekeepers. Referees for the galaxy. Silas disconnected from the data stream again, looking exhausted. There's a document here titled The Compact of Restraint. It's essentially a constitution for post-war galactic civilization. Limits on military force, requirements for diplomatic resolution of conflicts, protocols for protecting younger civilizations from interference. That's why new species were able to develop, Anlis said. The old powers deliberately stepped back. They created protected zones where emerging civilizations could grow without being conquered or assimilated. Bell felt something click into place in her mind. So the extinction was actually a collective decision to end an era. The age of galactic empires ended not because everyone died, but because everyone chose to stop. Malrax sat down on the floor, which for someone of his species' dignity was equivalent to a complete emotional collapse. 800 cycles. 800 cycles of academic scholarship built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what actually happened. We didn't study the Prime War. We studied the mythology that grew up around it. To be fair, Bell said, sitting down next to him, the mythology is pretty dramatic. Everyone died is a great story. Everyone got tired and decided to be reasonable is less exciting. But more hopeful, Anlis observed, and more useful. If civilizations can choose to step back from the brink, that suggests wisdom is possible even after catastrophic conflict. Gif settled his massive form onto the floor, making the whole chamber shake. So, what do we do with this? We've got 8 hours of research, and we've basically just rewritten galactic history. Malrax looked at Bell. We write a report. a comprehensive, fully cited, academically rigorous report. And then we present it to the council and watch my career explode. Or, Bell said with a grin, we present it to the council and start a whole new field of study. Real history, not just accepted tradition. Malrax's skin finally settled on a determined goal. Let's find out which one it is. The academic council chamber was designed to intimidate. Vaulted ceilings that stretched into shadow, a semicircular bench where 12 of the most distinguished scholars in the galaxy sat in judgment, and acoustics that made every whisper sound like an accusation. Bell had seen courtrooms that felt friendlier. "This is your proposal?" Council Chair Fendris asked, her crystalline body refracting light in sharp, disapproving angles. "You're claiming that 800 cycles of scholarship are fundamentally incorrect?" "Not incorrect," Malrax said, standing before the council with his data slate clutched in 4 of his 6 hands. "Incomplete, based on mistranslations and assumptions that were never properly examined." Bold words from someone whose entire career is built on those same assumptions, another council member said. A floating gas entity whose voice came through a vocoder. "Which is precisely why I'm qualified to identify the flaws," Malrax countered, his skin flashing defiant orange. "I've spent 26 cycles teaching this material. Nobody knows the traditional interpretation better than I do, and nobody is more certain that it's wrong." Fendris turned her multifaceted eyes toward Bell, who was standing slightly behind Malrax, with Gif, Silas, and Annalise. "And this conclusion was prompted by a first-cycle human student?" "The conclusion was prompted by evidence," Bell said, stepping forward. "I just asked the obvious questions that everyone else was too polite to ask." A ripple of what might have been amusement passed through the council. "Show us," Fendris said. For the next hour, they presented their findings. Silas displayed the trade records, the diplomatic correspondences, the casual bureaucratic documentation that proved civilization hadn't ended. And Liss recited the poetry and cultural records that showed conscious choice rather than desperate survival. Gif presented the military records with their surprisingly low casualty figures, and Malrax tied it all together with the compact of restraint, the treaty that had reshaped galactic civilization. When Malrax displayed the original archivist texts alongside the corrupted translations, the shift in the council's demeanor was visible. Fendris leaned forward, her crystalline structure catching the light differently. Other council members whispered among themselves, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of realization. The linguistic drift alone explains decades of misinterpretation, Malrax continued, his confidence growing. But the real failure was ours. Scholars who never questioned the narrative because it seemed too established to challenge. The council was silent when they finished. Finally, Fendris spoke. "If what you're saying is true, every history textbook in the galaxy is wrong. Every course on ancient conflicts is teaching fiction. The implications are massive," Malrax agreed, "but also hopeful. The traditional narrative teaches that advanced civilizations inevitably destroy themselves. Our findings suggest they can choose differently. They can learn. They can change. The political ramifications alone," another council member muttered. "If current governments realize the old powers deliberately limited themselves, then maybe current governments might consider doing the same," Bell said. "Instead of assuming expansion and conflict are inevitable, maybe they'll realize restraint is possible." Fendris's crystalline structure chimed softly, thinking. "This will require extensive peer review, independent verification, multiple institutions examining the primary sources. We welcome it," Malrax said. "In fact, we insist on it. Proper scholarship demands scrutiny." "Then you have it," Fenris said. "The Council authorizes a full academic inquiry into the nature of the Prime War. Malrax, you will chair the investigation. You four," she nodded toward the students, "are appointed as research assistants. This will be your focus for the next academic cycle." Bell grinned. Giff's rocky surface vibrated with excitement. Silas's tentacles waved frantically. Anlis's containment field pulsed bright gold. "One more thing," Fenris said, looking directly at Bell. "Human. What's your name for the historical records?" "Bell. Bell," Fenris repeated. "The student who asked the question that changed galactic history. How does that feel?" Bell thought about it, then shrugged. "Like I did what I came here to do. Learn stuff. Except it turns out everyone else had to learn it too." The council chamber echoed with sounds that might have been laughter. 3 weeks later, Bell was back in Malrax's lecture hall, this time as a guest speaker. The auditorium was packed, even more crowded than before. Word had spread about the human who'd dismantled accepted history with nothing but logic and snacks. Malrax introduced her with surprising warmth. "Today, we have a special lecture from someone who embodies the most important principle in academia: question everything." Bell walked to the front, Chip's bag in hand, and faced the sea of alien students. "So," she began, grinning at the crowd, "let me tell you about why you should never trust anyone who says everyone knows. Because if everyone really knew, someone wouldn't be here asking, 'But why?'" The lecture hall erupted in applause, tentacles waving, appendages clicking, containment fields pulsing with approval. And in the back of the room, barely visible, Malrax's skin glowed with pride. Turns out, being wrong was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Because being wrong meant there was still something left to discover. And discovery, Bell had taught him, was what academia was supposed to be about, in the first place. The galaxy hadn't ended 3 million cycles ago. But maybe, just maybe, the age of comfortable assumptions finally had.